And thank you all so much for joining us this evening for a very special event. My name is Michael Dubon. I'm a member of the WTAW Board of Directors, and I'll be your host this evening. So thank you so much for having me. To everyone, to WTAW Press, to Liz Green, who are here to celebrate her book launch, and to Brian and the rest of the crew behind WTAW. Uh, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this launch event for The Haunt by Liz Green. The Haunt is the winner of the WTAW Alcove Chapbook Prize. Here's a synopsis of The Haunt. Moving between lonely rural New York and glimmering New Orleans, a woman searches for a sense of home. Her quest is shadowed by an impulsive early divorce and a betrayal that shattered her family of origin and left her mother homeless. In dreamlike vignettes, The Haunt captures Liz Green's desire for belonging, grasped only in fleeting instances at restaurant tables. Comfort and inspiration come to her in flashes of unexpected beauty, passion, and heartbreak as she learns to embrace her past decisions as fiercely her own. We are so excited to share this beautiful book with you, Liz Green's debut. If you haven't gotten your copy of The Haunt, you can get one in our bookshop. Additionally, WTAW Press will also be at the, WTAW Press will also be at the 2025 AWP conference in Los Angeles, and Liz will also be there in person to sign books at T330. And the link to Liz Green's book is in the Zoom chat to access it there directly. A little bit more about Liz and her background and her bio. Liz Green's nonfiction has been featured in The Hunger, Fourth Genre, and The Wolf, among others. She received a PhD in English from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, where she won the Dr. James H. Wilson and Paul T. Nolan Creative Writing Award in Drama. Liz Green is a practicing psychotherapist in New Orleans. Liz, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you to everyone who came. I am really touched that you would take your time to be here. It really means a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And let me introduce who Liz Green will be in conversation with today, Brian Phillip Whalen. Brian Phillip Whalen wrote about the haunts. Green creates a window into the circumstances of violence, loss, and longing that haunt relationships. Hers is a story of bonds that bring people together and mistakes that tear them apart. In prose that's both lucid and lyrical, The Haunt invites us to ponder our own ghosts, the ones we will vanish, the ones we hope never leave us. Green's examination of hurt, hope, and renewal teaches us that to recover is to strike a balance between living and missing what is gone, a missing that will not stop. A little bit more about Brian Phillip Whalen. Brian Phillip Whalen's debut collection, Semiotic Love Stories, was named one of the best books of 2021 by Kirkus Reviews. His next book, In Each Breath of Darkness, Memoir, forthcoming from WTAW Press, chronicles his sister's heroin addiction and death by overdose. Brian's writing appears or is forthcoming in the Southern Review, Lit Hub, Creative Nonfiction, Coppernickel, Gulf Coast, North American Review, The Pinch, Poets.org, and elsewhere. He is an assistant professor of English at Mount St. Joseph University in Cincinnati, where he lives with his wife, daughter, and a dog named Porter. So again, Brian will be here in conversation with Liz, and we're so pleased to have you here, Brian. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for, sorry, I was late to that. Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to talk with Liz soon. Thanks.
Of course, thank you too, Brian. Just before we dive into the event, little Q&A announcement. I want to remind everyone that we'll be taking questions throughout the event. So please feel free to drop your questions into the Zoom chat, our Q&A section as they come to mind, and I will be collecting them as you drop them in the chat and be sharing those with Liz when the time comes for the audience Q&A section. But without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Liz to read an excerpt from The Haunt, which I'm so excited to listen to. It's always so great hearing authors read their own work, especially when it is so amazing like Liz's. So, Liz, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. So just a little backstory I'm just going to read a little selection here. The autobiographical speaker is kind of looking back on an earlier time in her life when she was going through a divorce and had just separated from her husband and moved 1,000 miles away from him. And at the same, shortly after, she began, getting involved in other relationships. And at the same time, this is me, but I'm a character in this, so I'm just using the third person. Her mom and stepdad were also going through a divorce. So there's two divorces going on at once. So it was a time of a lot of upheaval, transition, and loss. So that is the context. I didn't grow up in a mansion. The one my mom and stepdad, software engineers, could eventually afford in Western New Jersey. At 24, I'd escaped living with them when I'd moved for college. Their house was generic, cavernous, a McMansion that had been built with a crop of others in 1990. On either side of its affluent, isolated street, Rick Road, swaths of fields and woods spread as far as I could imagine. Decades before, our first hometown had been Fords, New Jersey, 1.89 square miles, not far from Staten Island and minutes from the Atlantic Ocean. Not the fun, idyllic ocean, an alluring destination, but an ocean comprised of garbage and medical waste. Few people have heard of Fords, a non-place. I've had to say I'm from near New Brunswick, a gritty, vibrant little city home to Rutgers University, which is neither close nor remotely similar to Ford's. Once your family moved away from Ford's and your world grew larger, even though Ford's hosted your earliest formative memories, you abandoned all connections to it. You had no roots. Near the end of my brief marriage, I rode in the back seat of my stepdad's Lexus on the way home to the McMansion from the Perryville Inn, the restaurant where we'd had a family dinner. Pitch dark county road, clusters of trees floating past. As I looked out the flickering screen of the window at the twisting, bare boughs, many intertwined, something happened. A hit of some knowledge, a truth, though I can't say now about what. In Ithaca, my boyfriend Nicky and I developed rituals, giving me a sense of permanence. Margs, he called margaritas, every Monday at Viva Taqueria, late night cocktails at Felicia's Atomic Lounge, where I sipped chocolate martinis and he drank the 57 Chevy, made with Chambord and muddled raspberries. He talked about his house. Nicky owned an aging, rundown green Victorian in a part of downtown the cops constantly patrolled. Emergency lights reflected on branches, flashed into the clouds, and pulsated on the sides of faded houses. When he wasn't waiting tables at Just a Taste, he worked on restoring the Victorian himself, meticulously sanding away layers of paint, stripping everything down to the original wood, unveiling the past. At Felicia's, I once secretly timed him talking about the house, 40 minutes before I could say anything. I'd settled into a garden-level apartment in Fall Haven, a brick complex next to a 150-foot waterfall, Ithaca Falls. Placed high in the living room walls, the windows were wide in the mid-century modern style. They faced a hillside, by turns an impossible green that glowed on my walls, or a snowy brightness harsh on my eyes. Most of my neighbors were elderly and eventually left for nursing homes or died. When I got tipsy, which was a lot, Lying on the wall-to-wall carpeting, I cried over a stack of photos that documented my relationship with my husband from start to end. 5 years had passed since the first ever shot taken of my husband and I, squinting outside at a crafts market in Mesilla, New Mexico, his arm curled around my shoulder. The last photo in the stack was of our fluffy, orangey cat, now gone blind. I wept over this image of my cat, settled contentedly on a nest of torn, shiny wrapping paper scattered on the bed my husband and I had shared. I'm left with how I've always been seeking. The family part of my life, a zone of constant movement. You could call it chaos, uncertainty, psyches and commitments in transition or transit, flux, disappointment of expectations, dashed hopes, hard truths. I find an oasis, restaurant or bar, where I can sit with a book or friend or lover, or most often by myself, and feel held in that space by all the staff's efforts to make the encounter special. The shade of lighting, style of chairs and tables, color of the walls and their displays of objects and images, the menus presenting possibilities of tastes, aromas, textures, all curating an experience, a reality. For years after I'd moved out, my husband, who taught creative writing, was stuck in our house in Auburn, Alabama, applying for academic jobs elsewhere. Raised in the Pacific Northwest, he'd always felt deeply isolated in the South. I closed the door to your office to save on the electricity bill, he said on the phone just after I'd left him. In Ithaca, I worked for a Tibetan Buddhist press. I swam in waterfall pools and shared joints at bonfires when they were offered to me. I walked everywhere, even in bitter cold conditions. Often and unpredictably, I was so depressed, the muscles in my face barely moved. Sometimes, when I try to visualize a loving, spiritual presence, a representation of God, I see my grandmother's face. Her soft Italian eyes, almost unbearably kind. It always surprised me they were brown like mine because her hair was an improbable red. During my childhood, she wore it in a bun, and even though the color was fading, the shimmering ginger hue suggested how brilliant it had been. In 1994, home from college on a break, I sat on her hospital bed at JFK University Medical Center after her second heart bypass surgery, sobbing about my love life, unable to concentrate on anything else, like the fact I should behave differently in a way that won't stress her heart. Her eyes said she was with me in my feelings and sad that I'm suffering, beaming total acceptance and support. She couldn't verbalize these sentiments because of her aphasia from multiple strokes, but at the same time, she existed in a place removed from my sadness. And she didn't get it, my suffering, so small compared to everything she'd been through in her long life. The previous year, she had lost her beloved of over 40 years, lung cancer. I'd fallen apart throughout my Pop-Pop's funeral services. A fiery Sicilian-American patriarch, his hair jet black into his 80s, he'd always shown his softest side to me and was more a father than a grandfather. When very young, I'd stayed at my grandparents' often and was confused about who my parents were. My grandmother, called Biggie for Big Mom, had always moved easily through the world, unlike me. Under 5 feet tall, with vivid, delicate, bird-like expressions, she wasn't big, but I'd made up the name for her as a small child. I'd needed something that felt cozier than grandmother for her. The nickname really caught on, and everyone, even random adults she had just met, called her Biggie. No matter what inner intensity she experienced, that lady was serene, never in a bad mood. She'd quickly make personal connections that became lifelong. With the butcher at A&P, her good friend. With the family of 2 doctors from India and their children who moved in across the street. The equally affectionate, uplifting Iyengaris became a close part of our family. Growing up, I was often at their or their relatives' houses. To everyone my grandmother knew, she'd mail tender-hearted greeting cards, postcards of pie recipes, or souvenirs from countries she and Pop-Pop traveled to after his retirement, Franklin Mint ornaments. In her presence, I felt safe and important. An effusive, warm optimism was part of how she took care of people. After her strokes, she'd say things she didn't intend and rocked an edgy sense of humor. Once, trying to politely describe my youngest brother's behavior, she called him a little bastard. Years later, when I'd phone from Ithaca and ask how she was, she might respond, "I'm 21 and gorgeous," or "reading the Bible." Then she'd laugh, a dark, subversive belly laugh. She was paralyzed on one side of her body. In her hospital room at JFK, she looked at me like I was the only person in the world, the most special being she'd ever seen. Today, I can't accurately envision Biggie's eyes anymore. Trying to is like watching an eclipse through a pinhole. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you for that amazing reading, Liz. Well, I would now like to transition us into Brian and Liz's discussion, where Brian will ask Liz some questions about her craft. And again, too, if any questions occur to you in terms of the narrative or the craft elements or other things that the reading elicited in you that you'd want to ask Liz about, please feel free again to drop those questions in the chat, or if questions occurred to you as Brian and Liz chat, please drop those into the Zoom chat and we'll touch base with Liz on those after Brian and Liz finish discussing. And Liz, I think you might need to plug your mic back in and out for a moment. It was a little distorted near the end. But it's totally okay if it's not able to be adjusted. So with that being said, let's turn it over to Liz and Brian as I invite them in a discussion about the book and the writing process, which I'm so excited to hear about. Thank you both.
Thanks, Michael.
Sorry, is this sounding normal or is it still funky?
That's perfect.
That sounds good. Yeah.
All right, great.
So Liz, let me start off by saying thank you for that lovely reading. It was such a pleasure to reread your book today in anticipation of our conversation. There's so much that I want to talk about. I have more questions than we'll get to. But it was also just wonderful. I had, the voice in my head reading, and then to hear your wonderful reading of it too is just outstanding to hear that out loud. It's a wonderful book for anybody who's, waiting to get it in the mail. They're in for a treat. One of the things that I admire most about the book is its ability to weave together the fragment. When you read it, folks will notice early on, short sections, short reflections, short scenes. I don't want to use the word tapestry because that seems cliche and overused, but it really is woven together in this beautiful way. It's also covers so many deep themes of family, of divorce, of love, of longing, childhood, as you mentioned and read about a little bit, just moving all over, uplifting your life, starting over, getting various degrees. And it also spans decades, which I find wonderful and marvelous that you were able to do this in such a way that the reader is always engaged and sort of on the edge of our seat. But we were never lost, and it all congeals in a wonderful way. So I'm going to have a question in a moment about the shape of the book, because I really want to hear about, kind of how you structured it, your thoughts on fragments and piecing, a larger narrative together out of shorter moments. But the first question is, as I mentioned, this is a book that spans decades, and it's a life from childhood through divorce and marriage and family to now. I would love to know a little bit about like the journey of writing the book. And I think really specifically, I could imagine this being a book you sat down and in a lucid year you wrote, or I could imagine this being a book that had little tendrils and stops and starts and revisions over, 20 years, honestly. So I would just love to know, like, where did the book begin for you as a writer, and how long it took you to, get to the finished product?
Oh, thanks for that awesome question. Well, I started writing it 13 years ago, and it was just a very brief piece, like 3 pages long or something. And then for years, well, first, let me just say, it just came out of kind of one image of sitting at the bar at this restaurant in Ithaca, New York, called Just a Taste. It's sadly COVID killed it, but it was there for a long time and it was an amazing place. But just this image of sitting there and looking up at these antique radios that were kind of on this high shelf, and just this wonderful, comforting atmosphere. And it just kept grabbing at me, that memory somehow, and I just wanted to somehow immerse back in it, or there was something in there and I didn't know what it was. So but anyway, for years, when I would kind of look at the piece once in a while, and I just felt like this needs to be a lot. There needs to be way more here, but I don't know where to go with it. So, I revised it and expanded it a little, but it just something wasn't happening with it. So then, just like 2 years ago now, I did this radical revision where I just expanded it a lot, and I used voice memos to do that. Some of it, like walked around or whatever, saying things into my iPhone. I love the voice memo feature so much. And then I would transcribe them. And then, so some parts were written that way and other parts were actually like just typed out or whatever. And like, it kind of just, I found that as I kind of needed to unlock something and just like let stuff rip a little, and just be curious about things and try to explore things until the story kind of told me like why it was haunting me or what it was, if that makes sense.
Very much so. I think it's fascinating too to think about, as writers, even if a book, I don't know, comes together easy. I don't think that would ever happen for anybody, right? But there's always these moments of, getting stuck on something, right? And having to kind of problem solve. So I love the idea of the voice memos. I've started to use that a little bit myself too, to kind of get unstuck, to work things out away from the page. I have a question, and it actually comes out, and I'm expanding this, right? The process and the genesis of the book. And I'm going to read a short quote from the book too, which is one of my favorites. And then I'm actually going to take it out of context to make a question out of it. But it's a lovely quote. So in the book you write, "You grow up in a mess of emotional truths impossible to understand from your own limited perspective. The pain and beauty of generations ago, other countries somehow still present, that your cells were swimming in since before you were born." And I absolutely love that idea of the cells you were swimming in before you were born. I actually want to take that to reading, because I'm thinking in this process, and you mentioned sort of 13 years, right? And as writers, the older I get, the more I realize just the influence of everything we've read from the first book to now. So my question is kind of two-parted. One, just like, is there anything, thinking of this idea of things that were swimming, before you were even born, is there anything before you even wrote this book that you remember kind of reading that like really inspired you or was interesting, that in some way, even subconsciously maybe, could have been working behind the scenes as you wrote this? Or, was there anything while you were writing the book that you really kind of, dug into somebody else's work that helped you, find your own voice and your own shape to the book?
Well, I was like thinking a lot about the lyric essay kind of before I started this most recent revision that, created this book. So that's like a genre within creative nonfiction that's kind of like a combination of essay and poetry, for those who haven't heard the phrase before. But so I was reading a lot of these kinds of essays that were very like innovative, from other writers. But I mean, the one I think of the most is the one I've been reading for like 25 years, Anne Carson, Canadian writer. She has this work called The Glass Essay that I think is just like a masterpiece, where she's weaving. I like the idea of like weaving together different threads and telling a story non-chronologically in fragments. I feel like, I guess that's always really interested me. And I didn't realize like it was just something you could do, that it wasn't just, my idols that did, but there could be other ways to tell a story, especially if you were stuck on it. You could kind of circle around it, or you take a few different perspectives on it. So I think like those are kind of some touchstones. And there's like a lot of lyric essay writers, and I feel like I'm not going to remember them. I tried to write some down for myself to just like, or like, people like Carmen Maria Machado. She has a way of telling a story that's incredibly innovative. And Chris Kraus, who writes autofiction, which is like autobiographical fiction. That's something I was really into around that time. So also the idea that just ways of like liberating stories from however they were stuck in our minds or memories, and like creating new possibilities for how we remember things by kind of like how we tell them in the moment when we tell them. Because like if I told like this story in this moment, it would probably be very different from how I told it 13 years ago or 2 years ago, if that makes sense. And I feel like writers that work in these more innovative genre bending forms are trying to find like new ways to or to break out of any kind of rigid molds within them, and to new ways to sort of shape things or tell things.
I love Anne Carson. I'm so happy that you brought her up.
Yeah.
I've been obsessed with her book of prose poetry, Short Talks, for a really, really long time, and I teach it whenever I can, even though my students don't want anything to do with it. But I just absolutely love it. I love what you're saying about, the innovations of form, and I agree too. I mean, there would be an interesting, way that you could just tell the book chronologically, but you'd lose a lot of the resonance and the circularity. And, so much of your book is also about memory, right? Of like when you're remembering and how you remember and how memories change. So I absolutely love the form. This might be like a strange question, and you can just say, that's stupid. It's got nothing. In the book, you mentioned that you were in the past a professor of acoustics and vibration. And I'm thinking
Uh-huh.
about, Anne Carson and what you said about, that form, and so much of what works in fragment and weaving things together in the lyric essay is like space. And you have a wonderful ear for leaving things out and for, using white space in the text to create tension and kind of resonance. And I have no idea if that has anything to do with acoustics and vibration, but it just seemed like those were words that I would use to describe the effect that you create through your use of the lyric essay form and fragments. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but
Oh, thank you so much for that. Well, actually, I worked for the professor of acoustics and vibration, so I was just this like editorial assistant. However, my father was a musician, and I would say, I mean, he still is, but he used to be in a band that performed, and so I think like his love of music and sound and rhythm, maybe is somehow part of that kind of like listening for, like what feels right in a
you,
sense.
I'm just curious, and this is just a kind of writer to writer. Do you ever listen to music? I have a question about reading and another question about reading too. But do you ever, I mean, when you're writing and trying to create a mood, do you ever listen to music when you're writing, or at all
Yes,
inspired by certain things to create mood?
I think I have underutilized that. I mean, I have sometimes, and like it can be very energizing. Uh, but yeah, I think I haven't really explored that enough, and I'd be really curious to hear, what you have discovered or how do you use it, if it's okay to ask.
Yeah, I guess I should be prepared if I ask questions. You can ask me the same question. Um, when I teach, I use a lot of music prompts for my students to kind of try to mimic, we'll listen to songs, or I'll have them go through their playlists, and, they try to create a mood or something. I don't ever do it directly like at the desk, but I think if there's certain things that I want to write, a certain kind of mood that I want to create, I might go and, be listening to those songs, away from the desk. I'm somebody who just, as a writer, I gotta have silence or I gotta have, brown noise blasting in my ears to be able to write. But I think I definitely find myself drawn to certain kinds of, music, maybe in a bad way if I'm writing sad things and then I'm just listening to depressing, sad songs all the time. I have like another nerdy question, I guess, nerdy writer or writer nerdy question here. Um, you talk about, Anne Carson and other lyric essayists being inspiring to you. Are you the kind of writer, not that you have to be one or the other, but are you the kind of writer who would, if you're being inspired by something, like you might actually pick up and study and like dissect, say something by Anne Carson, and then like, kind of do exactly structurally what she's doing? Or are you more of the kind of writer, which is more what I am, um, where you just sort of let yourself be inspired and you might read things and recall things, but it's more subconscious and it's more letting that influence run through you rather than being the kind of writer who like reads Hemingway to write a Hemingway sentence or something like that?
Yeah, I think definitely the second one, like the kind that you resonate with, of just, there's different things swimming around in terms of influences, and it's very like non-intentional.
Hmm.
Because I think if I tried to be like someone, I would get insecure that I wasn't as good as them, basically. So it's more like, wow, this is so inspiring. And then I feel like that just kind of organically, then it's like it becomes part of the interior landscape, perhaps.
Oh, that's wonderful. To not really to stick necessarily with the idea of acoustics, but I think it connects to another question I have. And feel free to be, really specific about this or just, loose with it too. So the shape of the book, again, just to stick with this, I absolutely love the shape. I mentioned I love the fragment. I play around and write with fragments. And the order is always so important, especially as you mentioned, like when you're telling something non-linear and you're going back. I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about, kind of how you're thinking about your own work in terms of fragment. If there is something with acoustics and space, if you I guess just your process too, like when you have the book and you said you kind of know it's a book, how did you fuss with it? When you were revising, did you have a specific process? Do you cut and paste things? Do you move things around? Do you print it out? But how did you end up, working through the challenge, which became beautiful, right? The end product, but the challenge of arranging these different pieces that go in and out of time in different storylines. How did you go through the process of making sure that you felt like that was the best order possible?
I really like collage, and it's not that I make artistic collages because it's not, I can't remember the last time I have, but the idea of that you're taking different fragments of text and then you're seeing what kind of relationship they have when you put them next to each other, just the way artists do when they put different textures or colors next to each other. So that's kind of how I guess I operate with like cutting and pasting and then seeing like, oh, how does this paragraph change when it's right before this one or when it's moved to be the last paragraph? Like, whoa. And then like moving things around creates all these different possibilities. And I think in terms of knowing which one is right, it's kind of just like an intuitive feeling of if it just keeps feeling off, then I'll have to keep moving things around until it just clicks. It's like there's some kind of satisfying click in a sense of you're reading it and it feels like everything has to be where it is. Then you kind of know that you don't need to move anything anymore. But I really love those kind of possibilities, and that's why I'm also a very long reviser. I revise for years, and I'll just wait until it really comes together and not force it because that process is much smarter than I am, basically.
I like the way of saying that, right? Time, right? Time and patience is greater than anything that I could kind of try to force onto the page. I was actually, you mentioned already, one of my questions was going to be, and I think this is a perfect time for it. I guess the difference between, drafting or writing and then revising, right? And, you've taught and I teach, and Michael was just teaching. I don't know if it was creative writing or not, right? But, I tell our students all the time, what is it? We say, oh, 99% of writing is revising, right? I'm just curious from you, just, personally, do you have different routines? You mentioned you revise and take your time. Do you have a different routine for like when you're writing? And then when you switch over and you know now it's revising, like do you do anything different? Is it all on the same computer? Is it different times a day? Would love to hear your different thoughts about the two approaches for writing and revising.
I think that I also would like to hear yours because maybe it'll give me ideas, which would be great. They're pretty similar to me, and maybe the only difference is voice memos for me are really part of the revision process because, or the initial creative creating. Actually, yeah, they're both because they're just kind of generating something raw that's going to have to be shaped later. But I think in terms of actually how it looks, it's kind of the same. And I think I probably favor revising in a way because I find it to be so incredibly creative that it doesn't seem super different from just from generating anymore somehow. But I know it is. So yeah, but it kind of looks the same in terms of like whether it's on a computer or speaking out loud. But I think that I like find so much joy and possibility in revising that it all feels equally kind of generative to me at the end of the day. I don't know if that answered your question or like what is it like for you
Yeah,
in
for me,
those
it's funny.
both those
I think a lot
processes?
about. Oh, sorry. There's a
Oh,
great Dorothy Parker line. I think it's Dorothy Parker. She's got a lot of great lines. But she said something along the lines of, "I can't write 5 words without revising 7," or something great. It's funny. I struggle with revision. I mean, everybody does, right? There's wonderful, as you said, possibilities. I'm somebody, and partly it's because I want to push all the possibilities to the limit. And I feel like when I'm revising, I always have more ideas and more ideas and more content. So revision for me is often, fraught, because I know that things can kind of click into place and have that wonderful feeling. But I also know that I could unclick them really easy because I want to, explore something else, right? That my mind is kind of always going. Um, I've found, when I write, I tend to write on, I have two computers, got a laptop and a desktop. And I stole this idea from David Lynch, the late David Lynch now. He lost a wonderful, brilliant thinker, and artist. But David Lynch has this wonderful book called Catching the Big Fish on transcendental meditation and writing. And one of his bits of advice for writers was to always have a computer in your house that is on all the time and has like a word processor opened so that if you ever have an idea, you can just immediately go and kind of hit it. So I do a lot of my writing on that one computer. And I was for a long time kind of like you, I would kind of do the writing and the revision at the same time. Lately, because it shifted, I've been taking advice from Matt Bell's book. Matt Bell's a wonderful novelist, and he wrote a book called Refuse to Be Done, which is how to write a novel in 3 revisions or something. And there's all these wonderful revision suggestions. And now I actually revise on my laptop, and it can't be in my office. He has other tips that worked on me too. Sometimes I will actually download my draft onto Kindle and I will go somewhere not where I like made the book, not at that desk in my office, and I will go somewhere else and I'll read it as though it was a published book, and then I'll take notes and then I'll go back. So I've just found for me, it's like I need to physically, get out of that first space of the generating to switch over into like reviser mode. Otherwise, I just kind of get lost and muddy. I went on a little bit too long. I'm curious for about you. Do you ever? You mentioned like the voice memos and copying and pasting. Do you ever print anything off and physically manipulate it, or do you ever look at it in different mediums, like on a Kindle or anything like that?
I have sometimes. Oh, by the way, I loved David Lynch, and I definitely now want to read that book on transcendental
That's a great book.
meditation. It's awesome, and I also just really liked what you were sharing about separating the processes because it's like we need a certain kind of permission to just go and generate things, and that's a different brain space than like kind of like creating order and putting it all together, right? But like, yeah, I have in the past. It actually strangely, it didn't work that well for me to, once I like chopped a bunch of things up. I think I still have them in a drawer somewhere, like a Tupperware of chopped up like lines that I never did anything with, but it was fun just thinking of arranging them. But I guess I ended up doing it on computer. But yeah, printing stuff out is actually really helpful. It's kind of like seeing it really differently from on a screen. I think I prefer that really, like to have some physicality, as well.
Well, now I'm thinking that maybe when you finally make your next collage, right? Like it'll be those little pieces of things and you can make some kind of art out of the snippets of like unused sentences, right? Um, I have another question. It's kind of um, it's not really shifting gears, actually. I mean, it is, but you mentioned like there's two sides of the brain, and I always go back to Natalie Goldberg and her book
Mm.
"Writing Down the Bones," where she says you got to be the writer, and when you're the writer, you got to turn off the editor, and then when you're the editor, you got to turn off the writer. Um, and they're kind of two now like maybe symbiotic, but also oppositional roles. Um, so I'm going to read a few quotes and then I have a question that hopefully will make sense out of the quotes. But there were a couple other wonderful passages that I just wanted to hear kind of out loud here. You wrote, in New Orleans, I went back to school and became a therapist, and I've been in this role for over a decade. I stay alert for moments of somebody feeling good about themselves or their life, making a sudden connection between conflicting or vastly different things inside that brings relief, and the universe sings. I love that line, the universe sings. And then elsewhere in the book, you wrote, that's where I would be if I could define home now. I would just be in ease. And I was thinking again, as your, dual roles, right, as a writer, right, and as a therapist, I don't know if those two inform each other at all. Like if, I don't know if when you're writing, you're in ease and in your therapy, there's tension and conflict because there's people. You mentioned elsewhere in the book, people who have difficulty with people, and I include myself, which is, it's fun to me, and to think about therapy in there too, right? So that there can be a tension in there. I'm just curious if you find those two roles working together, if they're ever at odds, the writer in you, frustrating the therapist in you messing with the writing in some way. I'd just love to hear about those two things.
Well, I think maybe if I really reflected on it, they're probably at odds in some kind of ways that I'm not aware of. So that'll be like homework in a sense. But like I think of them, I think they're pretty nurturing of each other for the most part because both are have to do with stories and making meaning and subjectivity. And for me, the core of both is that we can transform reality based on how we see it. That's what I try to do with therapy clients, like for them to do, right? And I want to facilitate, but like, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do as a writer in a sense. So, but I think the therapist role is kind of like self-sacrificial, and that can be at odds with the writer is kind of like it's all about me having catharsis of my stuff in a way, but like not entirely because you have to write something that's going to bring pleasure to whoever reads it in some way, that they're going to enjoy it or relate to it. So it's not ultimately, narcissistic in that way. But I think the healer role is different from it's the healer versus the artist in a sense, if that makes sense. That's kind of how I experience the duality of like the healer in me is really pouring out energy outward in a sense, and then the writer or the artist is kind of like more so trying to excavate stuff, my own stuff, so I can heal. And I think though that really probably helps me to do that for other people, and maybe seeing other people heal inspires me to know that I can also keep doing it. So yeah, I think that could just keep going on and on, really.
Well, that's so interesting. And I'm thinking I'm keeping an eye on the clock, so I want to make sure we leave time for other questions from the audience. And that's an important aspect of this, I think, too, right? And I am not a trauma specialist by any means. I tend to write about sad things in grief a lot, but that's just the writer in me. I have no technical skills. But we hear a lot about, right, and think about and when I teach to my students, the value and the therapeutic aspect of writing. I also read today, and I wish that I had written down the author's name. I think it was from Paris Review, a little blurb on Instagram. And a writer said, writing is not therapeutic. I still have my grief. And I'm assuming it was from a memoirist, right, or a poet who had written that. And I thought that was such an interesting, different thing. But what you'd said, right, too, is this idea of writing, kind of, you mentioned the catharsis for yourself, and then therapy is trying to lead other people there. I feel like, with a book like this too, right? One of the beautiful things is we get to experience through your words, right? You coming to terms as best you can, right, with your life and making meaning and making sense. And then when it gets out there and other people read it, then they make sense of their life through you making sense of your life. So I think it's, beyond that catharsis. And I'm sure you are left in some way with your grief and your life, and writing doesn't solve everything, right? But you've given a gift to other people too who have gone through similar or different experiences to be able to work their way through. And in those, I think, in those white spaces that you leave between the fragments, right? In those moments of pause, that they can kind of process and kind of dig into their own, baggage in a sense, and things that they need to work through. With that, so there are so many things I wanted to get into. It might not be interesting to people here. I so wanted to talk about Ithaca because I grew up in Binghamton, New York, and I went to college in Geneva, New York. And I'd been to Ithaca. The Haunt, I know that's not the main title, but The Haunt, we've talked a little bit about this, and I told Peg this when she asked me to read the book. I made a joke about The Haunt, and I said, oh, when I was in college, we used to drive an hour to Ithaca for 80s night at a place called The Haunt. And little did I know that Liz was actually also writing about, The Haunt in Ithaca. There were so
Yes.
many other wild connections, Liz, that we could maybe talk about another time. But even, there was the South and Alabama, and I spent 5 years in the South. Virginia, even. My folks are from Virginia, and I lived in Virginia for a while, not Charlottesville, but Harrisonburg. I almost went to get my PhD at University of Louisiana at Lafayette. So there's so many weird, kind of funny things, but it also, I think, speaks like that's really kind of weird, coincidences here. But I think it also does speak to the beauty of a book like this, where you are being vulnerable and opening yourself up to the reader so that whatever connections they want to make, even if it's just, I've been to Ithaca and I loved those gorges, right? But there's so many more deep, meaningful connections that you've allowed people to have, whether or not they've been to these places or not, that I think is just beautiful. And if you have anything else to say before we kind of, go over to the other, questions from the audience, I just feel like that may be a nice time to turn it over to the people who are interested in the book and who are in the audience today.
Yeah, I'll definitely turn it over to them. But thank you for saying that. I hope that kind of like catharsis and relating happens. I feel that way when reading other writers. And also, I had to also say that I taught college in Harrisonburg, actually at JMU for a year. So that's another coincidence. We didn't even know it was there. But
we'll have to talk another time. Like, I feel like if we dig into it, it's going to be like a weird movie where we realize we were
a David Lynch movie.
Seriously, yeah, that's perfect. It really is like a David Lynch movie. All right, but it was wonderful to talk to you. It was a beautiful book. I loved reading it. Everyone will love to read it. So I'm going to just throw it back to Michael, with a big thanks, Liz, for a wonderful conversation.
Oh, thank you so much, Brian. Yeah, this has been awesome. And I'm glad to know you.
Well, thank you both so much, Liz and Brian, for that wonderful discussion, excellent interview questions, and excellent responses. It was so cool and insightful. I'll turn it over to our first question from the audience. And folks, again, if you have any questions that came up in the course of it, now's a perfect time to drop more of those into the chat, and I will field those in a moment. But one craft and writing process related question we have for you, Liz, is do you read your writing aloud as you're revising? And a follow-up question for me on that, as you do, what does it help you see, or how does it help you interpret your own work?
Well, I think I should do that because I'm not in the practice of it, but when I do, it shows me that certain words are not needed or not flowing right. And I did write a couple plays a few years back, and I wrote them by just speaking them entirely out loud because it's dialogue. And I felt like that really made a huge difference in terms of the sharpness of the sentences or the way they flowed. So yeah, I think that's a great tool. And thanks for the reminder. It's a great question.
Mhm. I also have another process related question. And I think this is a good question to consider for, as you know, as writers and readers, because I think it just tells us a lot about how we overcome challenges, or sometimes we don't all the way. And so the question is, what was the most challenging part of writing this book, emotionally or structurally, or in terms of other craft elements?
Emotionally, it was challenging because when you're kind of looking at things that are so, personal or emotionally difficult times in one's life that were confusing or painful or embarrassing. And I feel like that's exclusively the territory where my writing likes to come from. So but really, honestly, the hardest thing about nonfiction in a way is it's making yourself and people close to you into characters because there's an ethics to that. There's an ethics of there's other people, you know, involved that you're talking about because it's part of your life, but also you have to talk about yourself in a way that won't be nauseating to your readers, where you can't always make yourself look good. You have to be willing to not look good sometimes. You have to be willing to share things, to really be real. And that's a delicate balance of knowing exactly what details will also because when with nonfiction, like your entire life is your possible material. So it's like knowing what to say, when to shut up, just how to say something in a way that anyone else besides you will care about it. All of that is challenging and was challenging in terms of this book, but also fun to try to figure out.
Yeah, that's so insightful too, in terms of like both the emotional process and the craft writing process, and trying to wrangle both of those complicated threads of the ultimate process of writing a book. Like Brian said, right? If it's never quite an easy process. So what is the endeavor without some challenges? So thank you so much for that insight, Liz. And I think a good follow-up to that question is right, you're talking about constantly, refining and reevaluating the work in terms of challenges, but I guess that also brings to mind the question of how did your perspective on the themes of the book evolve while writing it?
I think it evolved a lot in terms of kind of I start out not really knowing why I'm writing about something, and then by the time I finish, I know, or it's kind of changed and it's told me something maybe. So I'm trying to think with this book really, but I think ultimately it was kind of about healing or about um, what brings comfort or false comfort, and what do we really have when everything's been taken away or something. And I think that's not really where I started with it, but um, yeah, and I don't even know if I could put it into words, but it's kind of because it's like a gestalt that just comes out of the whole process. But yeah, I think I would say that it kind of ended up in a way like feeling kind of more hopeful to me than I expected.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, and I think that's such a helpful craft consideration, because I think often we have urges to tell stories about ourselves, but we wonder, well, what am I trying to say with this story? So like you said, it's a that combination of the writing revealing itself to you, and you wrestling with ultimately what is the meaning. And as a last question from me, now that The Haunt is out in the world, what do you hope readers take away from your story or this work overall?
I guess I hope that people who read it might find some connection to something personal for them that, you know, I guess does something useful or enjoyable or positive for them, basically. Like whether it's that they relate to something that I've laid out or, feel less alone in some way around something, or basically just that there is a personal connection. And I guess I say that because that's what I look for when I'm reading other people, is that kind of community of myself with the author and, with all books and people who read them, basically, if that makes sense. So thank you for that lovely question.
Yes, yep, that totally makes sense, and I love the insight and nuanced intersection of so many factors of writing and having an audience reading it. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming here and for supporting Liz. And that wraps up our event for the evening. Again, a huge thank you to Liz and Brian for being a part of this wonderful event. And we encourage you all to pick up a copy of The Haunt. We'll drop that link again in the chat. It is available now, and there's so many good reasons to get your own copy. As first of all, you heard it is a wonderful and dynamic and just impactful book. And of course, supporting great authors like Liz Green and small independent presses like WTAW Press. So thank you again, everyone. We hope to see you at future events. Some other announcements about upcoming future events. On April 3rd, we will celebrate the launch of Marissolandia with author Michelle Cruz Gonzalez and her conversational partner, Stephen Gutierrez. There will be a registration link for that dropped in the chat. We will also have a wonderful salon with a panel of readers on translations on April 17th, and there will be a link in the chat for that. And of course, we'll post about it on our social media. But if you'd like to save those links now, of course, the Zoom chat will close in a moment. So make sure you save all those great links from Liz's book to our upcoming events. And make sure to follow us, that is, follow WTAW on Instagram, Facebook, and Blue Sky to keep up with everything's going on and sign up for our newsletter. And with that, thank you again so much to Brian, and thank you again so much to Liz and to WTAW Press, and congratulations again, Liz, and thank you for giving us that amazing reading and such honest and sincere and such insightful responses to your process.
Um, Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Michael and Peg and Brian. And this has just been a tremendous experience. And yeah, I loved it. So thanks again.
Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful night.